AWSIAM User Role Description in entities granting access to AWS resources. These entities are used to control who can access your AWS resources and what they can do with them. Users represent individual people, while roles represent non-human entities like applications or services. Prerequisites: AWS account. You must have an AWS account to create and manage ING users and roles. Understanding of ING policies. ING policies define the permissions that users and roles have. You should understand how to create and manage policies before using ING users or roles. Use cases: access to AWS resources. For specific users, you can create an ING user for each individual who needs to access AWS resources. This allows you to control their access based on their specific job functions. Granting permissions to applications. You can create an ING role to grant permissions to applications that need to access AWS resources. This allows you to manage access to your resources without having to provide your own credentials to the applications. Centralized access management. ING allows you to centralize access management for all of your AWS resources. This makes it easier to control who has access to your resources and what they can do with them. Step-by-step implementation of general use cases. Create a user or role. Use the AWS Management Console, the AWS CLI, or the AWS API to create a new user or role. When creating a user, you will need to provide a username and password. When creating a role, you will need to provide a role name and a trust policy. The trust policy defines which entities can assume the role. Attach policies to user or role. Once you have created a user or role, you can attach policies to it. Policies define the permissions that the user or role has. You can create your own policies or use predefined AWS managed policies. Configure permissions for access. After attaching policies to a user or role, you can configure the permissions for access. This includes setting access keys and secret keys for users, and setting permissions for roles to access specific resources. Challenges and fixes: overly permissive policies. Giving too much access to users or roles can increase the risk of security breaches. Use least privilege principle. Only give users and roles the minimum permissions they need to do their jobs. This will help to reduce the risk of security breaches. Incorrect permissions: if users or roles have incorrect permissions, they may not be able to access the resources they need. Review and refine policies. Regularly review your ING policies to make sure they are still appropriate. If you find that users or roles have too much or too little access, adjust their policies accordingly. Access denied errors: if users or roles are getting access denied errors, it means they do not have the necessary permissions. Verify permissions. Make sure that the user or role has the necessary permissions to access the resource. Check for policy conflicts. If a user or role has multiple policies attached, there could be a conflict between the policies. Check the policies to see if there are any conflicts. Ensure correct service and resource names. Make sure that the service and resource names in the policy are correct. Security vulnerabilities: if users or roles are not properly configured, it can create security vulnerabilities. Use strong passwords. Require users to use strong passwords and enforce password complexity requirements. Enable MFA. Enable multi-factor authentication (MFA) for users and roles. This will add an extra layer of security to your AWS account. Regularly audit permissions. Regularly audit the permissions of users and roles to make sure they are still appropriate. Implement security best practices. Follow AWS security best practices to help protect your account. Difficult to manage multiple users and roles. Managing a large number of users and roles can be difficult. Use in-groups to manage permissions at scale. Create in-groups and assign users to groups. You can then attach policies to groups instead of individual users. This will make it easier to manage permissions for large numbers of users. Automate ING management. Use AWS tools and services to automate ING management tasks. This will help you to manage ING more efficiently. Use tools for ING auditing and reporting. Use tools like CloudTrail and CloudWatch to audit and report on ING activity. This will help you to identify potential security risks and ensure that your ING is properly configured.